Awesome. Thank you, Kostya. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Good to be with you all again. It's been a minute. So I guess since the last time I was here, Happy New Year. Hopefully 2021 is treating you a little bit better than 2020 did so far. Um, Today, as you know, I'm going to be going over, excuse me, I'm going to be talking about Vasyl Ivanchuk. I know Kostya said Vasyl. I'm going to say Vasyl, even though I guess that's maybe not the most proper way to say it. But um, yeah, basically, Ivanchuk was a great player, still is a great player. And if you wanted to, learn more about him in depth, I'm sure you could like Google him and look on Wikipedia. I'm going to just give you a very I guess basically the best way I can describe him is this guy was an like a true genius and giant in chess, and he was top five in the world more or less for a few decades, on and off. And on his best day, I truly believe he was greater than basically anyone that's ever played. And so he sometimes struggled with consistency, but this was a guy that was true genius. He spoke a ton of languages as well. He was very intellectually curious, and I think that's sometimes rare for chess players, where they just kind of have the tunnel vision on chess, or at least that was the stereotype for a long time. And this guy Ivanchuk so profoundly went against that stereotype. So I think that was kind of a cool thing as well. Um, there are many, many games I could show. I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of the games. Hopefully you have. They're really spectacular games. There's some that come to mind that I'll just say that are not going to be, I'm not going to show today, but like there's a game he won against Kasparov. That's a classic where he's white and he plays Bishop B5 check and a Moscow variation of the Sicilian. That's really memorable. There's a semi-Slav game he played against Shirov. That's a really spectacular where he plays Queen G7. The two games I'm going to show today, and I hope we have time for both games, Kostya, we'll see, are games that are probably less known, to be honest. But these are the ones that I think are, frankly, have been most impactful for me, aside from the super popular ones. The two games I'm going to show today really left a serious, serious impression on me, and I hope they do for you as well. So without further ado, I think I'll just get started. Does that sound good, Kostya? We're good? I think so. Okay. This first game is actually from 2009 and was played at Chorus, which is now known as Tata Steel. So it's played in Wijk in the Netherlands. Yeah, this game I think is not a super well-known game, but it's just made a tremendous impression on me. And so let's take a look. I'm aiming to show two games of Ivanchuk, so we'll see how we go with the time. So anyway, so E4, C5, Sicilian, knight F3, D6, knight C3. It's interesting that Ivanchuk actually played knight C3 here instead of D4 right away. One thing that Ivanchuk was very much known for was always going his own way relatively early. And basically, he actually plays D4 on the next move, but he was always someone he was kind of the king of like second choice and third choice moves of the engine before it was really trendy. Because I recall, everyone knows like Carlsen is the king of like, just getting a position and like outplaying people, and he kind of spurred that wave. Ivanchuk was that guy before Carlsen was that guy in a way. And so you'll see him kind of go his way, not play the absolute main lines, but play like a sideline and know it like a main line. I do see a first question here, which is worth asking. Daniel asked, do you think E5 equalizes here? Says knight C3, not playing D4 right away. It does allow E5. To my opinion, I mean, I'm not like a major Najdorf theoretician, but my opinion is no. And the reason for that is I think white has pretty comfortable play after bishop C4, just playing on the light squares. And if black will eventually have to play bishop E6 to kind of play against that light square domination, but white doesn't have to capture. So white could play moves like D3 and play some type of bind in this fashion. And in fact, there is a line of the like Rossalimo that is kind of similar, that was trendy in the mid to late 2000s, probably before some of you were even born, that I remember, where it went like knight c6, bishop b5, e5, and knight c3, and these types of positions. Oh wait, no, it wasn't bishop b5 here. Maybe it was knight c3 here and then e5. But I recall some games that you can look up between, in a structure like this, between Kamsky and Shirov actually at the World Cup. And there was a structure where Kamsky was white and playing on the light squares and had sort of a nice little positional bind. And sometimes they maneuvered the knight with like knight e2, knight c1. And then there were some weird knight maneuvers to get the knight to the center. Or no, it was the wrong knight. Sorry, it was d3, knight d2, knight f1, knight e3 to get the knight to d5. And there are some interesting games that are worth checking, beyond the scope of the time we have here, but definitely something worth looking at. So the answer is no. I don't think it equalizes, because I think the bishop being on c4 is just a better diagonal for e5 stuff. So anyways, d6, knight c3, knight f6, d4. We're back in proper open Sicilian land. And after a6, we have a knight off. Many different ways you can handle this position. So, I'm not going to ask you guys, there's bishop g5, there's bishop e2, there's knight b3, there's a4, there's all f3. We're just going to look at what Ivanchuk played and then kind of stop in the middle game, because this has been played before. So bishop e2 was Ivanchuk's choice. E5, knight b3. Sometimes it's trendy these days to go knight f3. I'll say that much. And sometimes people play bishop g5, take on f6 very quickly, and then play on the d5 square. I don't think it's so dangerous for black if you try this type of play, but this is kind of been modern attempts to kind of basically play against the d5 square. Instead, Ivanchuk played knight b3, and after knight b3, bishop e7, castles, bishop e3, bishop e6, queen d2, and knight d7, and a4. And this has all been played before. That's why I'm actually going through it quite a bit. I will stop where I believe there was a novelty, but this has all been played before. Basically, when you're playing bishop e2 and bishop e3, you're either playing for f4 or you're playing for a grip on d5. Can anyone tell me actually, if white plays f4, how black typically reacts in those structures? I'll give a moment.
It's a good question. I think usually black goes e takes f4.
And
tries to
all right, so I'm gonna give this a go and say, Asish, why don't you, if you can unmute yourself and tell us what's happening. What's the typical strategy with f4?
Oh, I said like take on f4, then like knight e5, and
sorry.
And it's like an outpost.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, a lot of times you take on f4, and then after, let me make a move instead of a4 just to show. So f4, e takes f4, bishop takes e4, knight e5. And yeah, what happens in these Sicilians is that the d6 pawn is actually not that weak, and the compensation and the half open file, and also the e4 pawn sometimes being just as weak as the d6 pawn kind of compensates. And actually, one of the big myths of the Sicilian is that the d6 pawn is weak, because you can find, basically thousands of games, and the d6 pawn is never actually taken and won for free. So the idea that the d6 pawn is actually weak is never really the real issue. It's really the d5 square that is the issue. And so, yeah. I should say also, of course, the knight on e5 is just a rock, right? It can't be hit by any pawn anymore now that the d and f pawns are gone. So it's completely justified with this knight on e5. So black is usually doing very well here. One thing that does happen a lot, though, is that when the knight captures on e5 and the pawn on e5 is gone, all of a sudden the knight on b3, which basically had zero activity with the pawn e5, all of a sudden comes to d4 again, and sometimes can play on f5 or play on e6. not super relevant here because f4 didn't happen, but something to know if you're playing the Sicilian. This knight on b3 does wind up doing stuff at some point. So anyways, instead, after knight bd7, Ivanchuk played a4, kind of restricting move, playing against b5. And again, it's just, Ivanchuk is a guy that's always going his own way. So you're not going to really see him play like, you know, the absolute topical main line at the time. He's going to kind of play like, typically he's going to play like a slight variation within the main line. That's something he did throughout his career with great success. And frankly, he was someone, I should say, that, you know, basically was impossible to prepare for because he literally played everything. He was well known for being kind of a universal player. And of course, to be a super strong player, you think everyone is universal, but that's not actually the case. There's some players at the top now, I would argue, aren't particularly universal, to be honest. One person I would for sure say is not a universal player, in my opinion, is Maxime Vasyl Ivanchuk, for instance. I think actually that's one. I mean, I know he's tied for the lead in the candidates right now, but I actually don't believe he's a universal player. You can debate me on that, but you know, he plays his Grunfeld, he plays his Najdorf, and that's pretty much what he does. And he plays e4, pretty much. That's it. So, anyways, after a4, queen c7, connecting the rooks makes some sense. Rook fd1, and this kind of suggests what White's plan is, this rook d1 idea, because now you can kind of see that White is not really breaking with f4 or anything. So what do you think White's next few moves are? What the strategy is with rook fd1?
I imagine playing for knight
this
d5.
Is an open question.
Be like bishop f3 and then knight d5, something like this. All right,
so I see one answer so far. I see a few more coming in. I'm gonna give a shout out to Aradhya. Can you tell me what you're thinking?
Yeah, so I was thinking like he's probably gonna go something like f3, knight d5, and black really cannot take, because he has to give up the bishop here, and that's his good bishop. Or like he goes knight take d5 and his bishop gets trapped. And also d5 is the weak square of the Sicilian, so it makes sense to like go after it.
So one thing I'll say is I think f3 is somewhat reasonable. Knight d5 is actually less so. And the reason for that is whenever knight d5 is played, black is going to react with knight takes d5. And after you capture with the pawn, go bishop f5. And those structures are actually extremely pleasant for black. The reason is, and just to show, actually, I'll just put on the board. Let me say, whose move is it here? It's black's move. So let's just say, for argument's sake, there's rook c8. No, actually, rook c8, then the c2 pawn is hanging. Let me make a move like h6. So actually, even h6 I don't like. I'll talk about why I don't like it. But anyways, let's say knight takes e5, e takes e5, bishop f5. So the reason these types of structures are actually really good for black and the Najdorf, or at least extremely playable, is because all of a sudden there's no pressure on the d file, and essentially the d5 square is occupied by the pawn. And so, you know, essentially that potential outpost is no more. And then the flip side is black has this really nice kingside pawn majority with which they can kind of get going. And these types of positions tend to favor black because the knight on b3 is that all of a sudden very, very silly and won't be corrected anytime soon. So putting the knight on d5, you really have to consider this type of transformation in the structure. That being said, I don't think f3 was unreasonable because you kind of continue your grip on the e4 pawn, or you protect the e4 pawn and maintain your grip on d5. You just have to be careful about jumping with knight d5. Now, the reason I thought that I wasn't so thrilled with my h6 move that I basically just said like, oh, let's just make a pass to give the turn to white to explain this, was because in certain structures, it's nice to have the bishop on g6 and to be able to meet some type of exchange on g6 with h takes. And so if white was to play a move like bishop d3, bishop g6 is no longer available because f takes g6 is a pretty positionally undesirable way to recapture, because all of a sudden black lacks the control on the e4 square after what they would have with a move like f5. So that's why I was a little bit bothered by my pass. But without a doubt, I think even so, black's position is probably pretty playable here after just taking on d3. Sometimes they even play e4 here to grab more space, but you always have to be a little bit hesitant because the knight jumps into d4 and gets some activity later on. And then that makes it a bit more difficult to play f5 because then the e6 square is sensitive. So some nuances. Whenever you push the pawns, you create weaknesses, and it's just important to think about that. I mean, even h6 here, you see the square adjacent to where you push the pawn is always the one that's weakened, the square next to the pawn, where the pawn is now. So anyways, I was a fan of f3, but knight d5 hold off on. So anyways, after it was black's move after all, and black played rook a8, and white now actually played a5, continuing this grip on the queen side, and kind of just basically playing for restriction. At the end of the day here, black is not doing too poorly or anything, but white is just trying to kind of ask black to show or reveal their plan. And shout out to Royal Buchanan, who did point this out. I didn't call on you, but kudos. After a5, black played the move knight c5. And I think this move, in my opinion, is actually a little bit of a mistake because it basically trades this knight on b3 that was not really doing so much at the moment. So I can understand why, trading this knight is attractive. You get rid of your d pawn, maybe the rook comes to the d file. But now all of a sudden, the c5 pawn might be a potential target, and you basically remove all of your counterplay on the c file. So, Ivanchuk very quickly played knight takes c5, and I think he was pretty happy to see this transformation because after d takes c5, queen e1, you could see here that this d5 square is a little bit soft. You can't really push the b pawn because there's always en passant, and it's not so attractive here. Black's bishop's on e7 is not so great, and I think white has gotten the better of this exchange. So it's already kind of interesting to figure out, like, how would you even play with black here? How would you try to get some activity? Because I think structurally, white is a bit better. Anyone have any strategies for how black could play here?
Yeah, welcome to all the raiders. We're just in the middle of the class here. Kassa is teaching the kids in Zoom. This is the US Chess School. And we're just
Daniel, you want to share your plan?
Observing.
I said c4 and bishop c5 just to trade off white's good dark square bishop for our pretty poor dark square bishop.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if you go c4, what if I go No, that's interesting. What if I go f3?
So are you planning to like queen f2?
Right.
Interesting. Like, aren't you weakening your dark squares when you're about to trade them off? Technically.
Yeah, but I think my queen will get some dark square coverage on e3, and your bishop on e6 after c4 really is not going to have any type of prospects anyway. So, I mean, and also you're giving my queen some type of entry into the queen side, basically, after the exchanges. So the end games become, a bit unpleasant, I think. Like sorry, not queen c6. If you have this type of transformation, let's say you would just exchange.
Yeah.
I mean, your bishop on e6 is pretty poor. The c4 pawn is maybe a target at some point, and I could entertain some type of something on b6.
Yeah, I don't like. I think black is worse. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think black is kind of suffering here. But it's a fair idea. I mean, we're trying to improve on the games. Jed, you want to suggest?
Yeah, I realized my move. Okay. Well, now I realized my move was a mistake because of knight d5. But my idea was knight d7, idea knight b8, and knight c6, and knight d4, which is a good idea in the long term. But I feel like right now knight d5 is a bit of a problem.
Yeah. I mean, if you had the time to do that, that would actually be a pretty legit plan. It's just a question of timing, and there's always that issue with when you have a knight and you're trying to get it to a square 2 diagonals away, it's going to take 4 moves, right? So that's actually something, when you're, I'm sure some of you are playing, blitz or maybe even bullets. I'm not a bullet person myself at all. In fact, I can't stand it because I'm not very good at it probably. But when you're playing blitz, you always know, right? If your king is being checked by a knight, you want to move it to the square 2 diagonals away from the knight, so that you've not checked for another 3 moves. And it's always one of those things that's really a nice element of geometry that's good to know, so that you can kind of carry on whatever your attack is, so that you don't flag. So something to just keep in mind, that 2 diagonal concept. Whenever you see that as an issue, or whenever you see the knight trying to get to a square 2 diagonals away, it's going to take way too long typically. So yeah, so anyways, I think one plan, well, we'll see what Black did in the game. Black played the move Rook F8. I do think this is the best move. I mean, this is Karjakin after all, and he's a pretty reasonable defender. And yeah, you just want to try and fight for the D5 square a little bit. And also in some positions, Rook D4 actually might be a very interesting idea. Just kind of, almost like a classical type of exchange sacrifice type of thing, to try and basically disbalance the position a little bit, and also maybe even if you get the central pawn for this Rook D4 idea, can be quite a theme. So anyways, after Rook F8, White played the move Rook takes D8, which is a good move. And after Rook takes D8, played F3. And yeah, White is just very slowly consolidating. You can see this Queen F2 stuff might be decent. Yeah, I think White has some plans because of the gains being made on the queen side right now. You could say with this A5, A6 fixture. But I want to get to the good stuff, because I do want to get to the second game, which I think is in some ways even made a bigger impression on me than the first. So I really want to keep it moving a little bit. But after F3, Black played C4, which was consistent with a plan that was already suggested. And White played Knight A4, and I think this transformation with C4 and Knight A4 really did kind of change the game in a quite a serious way. Now, Rook D4 is not as strong as before. First of all, White doesn't have to take right away, but also the pawn on E4 is not being won. So that I think Rook D4 is not as strong as the previous exchange sacrifices. Although I should note that if White takes immediately, maybe C2 is hanging, and maybe there is something for the exchange. So it was an idea, but White doesn't have to take. White can even still go Knight A4 and then go C3 and dig out the rook on D4. But after C4, Knight A4, you see there's this these squares that are being fixed are all of a sudden really an issue. And Ivanchuk just handles this beautifully over the next few moves. So this is what this part of the game kind of left the impression on me that I hope all of you appreciate. So Knight D7 was played, keeping more of an eye on the C5 square. Queen C3, another nice maneuver. Part of the Queen E1 is not just F2, but also C3. Notice that the Queen E1 also protected the A5 pawn, which was pretty important. F6, covering the E5 pawn, makes some sense. B3. Now, B3 was actually not the best move. Instead, B4 right away was a little bit better, just taking away the C5 square from Black's minor pieces, and then the squeeze job can begin, because the C4 pawn is a little bit weak, and one can consider Knight B2 at some point. There's also Rook D1 first, maybe trying to trade the rooks before Knight B2. I recognize that my arrow from D1 to E7 is a bad arrow, so I'm gonna redraw it. And yeah, I mean, White is better here. I mean, for sure. You can see White's play on the queen side is just constricting, very constricting. So B3 happened, Rook C8, and then B4. So Ivanchuk corrected himself slightly.
Interesting.
And after Queen C6, White played Queen A3, and I think this was really a really critical position for Black, because now all of a sudden the Queen A3 is uncovering the knight on C3, giving the knight the C3 square, and potentially doing some other things as well. The some other things is a bit ominous. But how would you play as black here?
Oh, white is starting b5, guys. That's what's going on. White's starting b5. So we got to be careful.
Anyone? C3. So someone's saying C3. Raya, why don't you tell me about that? Tell me about what's going on. Why C3?
Okay, because why wants, like, for example, like at some point he will play c3. I'm not saying he has to play yet, and then after c3 we like black's pieces can't really do much. For example, we just play rook d1, and even just king. We can even play king f2, and then just play g4 or something. But
So
after
you're saying C3 for white or for black?
so what I was saying, white's idea where at some point play c3.
Okay.
So
So
I
white.
play c3 to open up the position. Yeah, probably I might lose the pawn, but then all our pieces are active. So that's
Yeah, no, C3 makes some sense, kind of activating this bishop on E6, which is not very good. Also, in some ways, splitting the B and C pawns in a way, kind of disconnecting them for activity. I also see Nathan. Tell me what you're thinking. Oh, your mic is compromised. All right, so you're saying it isn't was suggesting F5, and yeah, that's a pretty active move. Basically, trying maybe to loosen the construction on the king side here, maybe getting some play on the king side. Well, it's funny because black actually played the move F5. Karjakin played F5, and he clearly missed white's response. But it's not just the response that's so impressive. It's really the sequence of moves from here to the end of the game. I will say I analyzed this just for a little bit. It was not even a long time, so I maybe would have had to put it on much higher depth to be completely conclusive. But I believe King F8 was actually a better move than F5. And the reason that's the case is because F5 has kind of a tactical flaw that I think some may have spotted already, and it's the move B5. It makes sense. I mean, basically, you see this bishop that's unprotected on E7, and I think most of us here, maybe all of us here, can understand that bishop takes A3, B takes C6 is winning on the spot because after you have this position, you can see the bishop and the knight are both hanging. But what's so spectacular about this sequence is that it requires so much more work to actually win the game. And Ivanchuk was so good at working out complications in irregular positions that I thought I had to show this. And I was like, I remember looking at this game, I was like, what happened? Because even after this tactic, I didn't think black was, lost. And so after B5, you cannot take on A3. So black has to deal with the B5 pawn and played A takes B5. And after queen takes E7, B takes A4, we got the bishop pair, but it looks like there's an absolute mess on the board. I mean, first of all, this A pawn looks like it's, kind of this A4 pawn, I should say, is actually looking kind of active. Our queen is kind of in the hornet's nest, but kind of a lone wolf right now. And it seemed to me at first sight that this shouldn't be a position where it's like white is killing it, but it's the case. And so how would you play as white here to keep this game going? Keep the initiative going?
Interesting question. Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like black's position is like super loose here, right? Like light squares are weak. My first instinct is just rook d1. Simple.
Maxwell?
Yeah, hi.
Hey. What you thinking?
So I was thinking I would take the f5 pawn here, and then after bishop takes, I could go queen to b4, hitting both pawns, and then b5 to protect the a and c pawns, and then rook b1, and it would be really easy to pile on that b pawn.
So a few things. So e takes f5, bishop takes f5, queen b4. You were saying b5, but I would just go bishop takes c2. And right now the a pawn is covered, the c pawn is covered, and even the b pawn is covered. And it's not clear to me that that white is better at all, because I can put the bishop on b3, and then all of a sudden I have two really dangerous passed pawns, right? The other thing I wanted to point out is if b5, yeah, now I would start to agree with you, because now you can even, instead of rook b1, let's not forget about en passant, right? And then the b pawn is a huge asset. The a pawn is hanging now, and yeah, this one I might feel a little bit more inclined to agree white is doing well. But even here, bishop takes c2 scares me a little bit, because I'm not totally sure I see a direct win after b7. Actually, no, b7, rook b8, maybe bishop takes c4 is actually winning, or queen takes c4. So it's close. It's closer. But of course, black couldn't play bishop takes c2 instead of b5. So it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. And it's really not obvious. It was really not obvious to me when I saw this game, 12 years ago now, geez, that how white should continue here. And Ivanchuk just worked it out. Really, he played really top moves here. So the first move is actually rook d1. And kudos to the folks that did see that, because there were a few folks that did see that move.
Thank you, Kassa.
And
thank you.
It's just kind of counterintuitive to move the rook away from where the a pawn is when it's so close to queening. But the point is that the queen is actually holding the a3 square still, and all of a sudden rook d6 is a serious threat. So even with this pawn that's very close, you're still playing through the middle and trying to make stuff happen. And I thought that's just really good judgment. Karjakin played knight f8, which is the best move, protecting the e6 bishop again, and just making sure that rook d6 is not a decisive threat. But Ivanchuk played rook d6 anyway, because essentially it's very difficult to kind of defend this, and rook takes e6 is an issue. And the pawn can be collected. That's kind of the thing. Like if the queen goes to some type of lazy square like b5, well, then the house will be collected, because you'll have exchanges that basically lead to all of the pieces, being lost. And let's not forget, the queen is still eyeing the a3 pawn, or the a3 square. So I just thought it was tremendous judgment, but it gets even more beautiful, basically. So after rook d6, rook e8 was played. And here it seems like, well, wait, we're trading queens here? I mean, this is not a good outcome with the a pawn being passed as it is. But there are proper solutions here. And basically, after rook takes e6, rook takes e7, white is still in the driver's seat. How? Wow, these kids are good. Zoe, talk to me. Oh, sorry, I just muted you by mistake. Go ahead.
I played bishop c5 to counterattack black's rook and prevent pawn a3.
Bishop c5, that's a nice
beautiful
move.
And it's so nice, again, it just, I don't know, when I saw this, I was just like, wow. It's just so much energy. And yeah, that's the move. Bishop c5 is the move. It's so important that you control the pawn, but it's just a flair to do this, and to also recognize, okay, that if you take on e7, and all of a sudden the a pawn is this major asset, I think was really just spectacular. So after bishop c5, black is not lost yet, by the way, I should say. Like Karjakin is defending, like, the minister of defense that he would soon become. I wouldn't say at this point in time he was the minister of defense, but that was like another almost 10 years. So rook d7. This move, rook d7, was actually not the best move. It turns out rook e8 is a bit better. And I think I looked at, rook c7, and, the knight crawls back into the game. And it's not totally lost here, but white is for sure in the driver's seat. But instead, we had rook d7. And now white just goes rook b6, and everything is kind of under control. The bishop is controlling a3. The material is, the a pawn is still an asset. Black is still a pawn up for the time being, but the a pawn can be rounded up, and the bishop pair becomes the really important factor. And I think one of the really great strengths of, people, it's a kind of a rare strength, but a really great strength of super strong chess players is they know when to switch from, tactical to positional and back to tactical if they need to, but they can change the modality of the game pretty much when they need to, depending upon what the situation basically requires. And so being able to switch, to channel switch is actually something that's very, very, very valuable.
Absolutely.
So anyways, after rook b6, black took on e4. What else? And after f takes e4, you just kind of notice that all of black's pieces are kind of tied down. Like the rook is tied down to the b7 pawn. The knight is tied down to the defending the bishop. The bishop on e6 is pretty restricted. It just seems like it's very, very difficult to move. And it wasn't something that was obvious, 5 to 10 moves ago, but clearly it was obvious to Ivanchuk that this was a position where white is, really got loosening the screws, even though they're material down. It's just, there's so much control. So anyways, black played the move c3, and it kind of goes downhill from here. But white played the move king f2, which I thought was absolute class. I actually should have asked everyone what was the move here, because you can begin tactical operations, but Ivanchuk judges, you know what, instead of kind of rushing to clarify things, I'm just going to improve my king first. So I won't answer a question. So Zoe asked, why not bishop takes f8 instead of f takes e4? That's a good question. I think it has to just do with the a pawn, right? So if bishop takes f8, king takes f8, rook takes e6, a3, all of a sudden that pawn is, kind of a problem. But okay, maybe the line doesn't end. We do see bishop takes c4. Let's see. Now you have to put on the calculation hat. So maybe rook d4 is annoying, and maybe the bishop has a hard time staying on the diagonal, would be one guess. Maybe there's some like bishop a2, rook d1, and rook a1 type of situation, and then basically after a2, and if bishop b3, well, yeah, maybe it's not so clear. So bishop b3 instead, maybe rook b4 is an issue, and again the bishop on b3 is hit, so you have the idea of just taking and going a2.
That's rook b6.
There's rook b6. Yeah, it's not. I didn't analyze this point, but it's actually a very interesting question. Why not taking on f8? Let's see. And if there's any suggestions, I'm happy to take them. So bishop takes f8. King. We're assuming king takes f8. Rook takes c6. And what is black up to? So I'm seeing some suggestions of rook d2. So bishop takes c4, a3, rook d1, and rook d2 to pick up the pawn. That's from Nathan. That actually is a pretty interesting suggestion. There's also combinations of e3 now that the pawn is hanging. So let's look at that. So like a3, E3. Bishop takes c4. Yeah, this is actually kind of dangerous, because actually maybe we can start with e3 to threaten some type of mate, maybe, or no. Yeah, maybe e3 actually right away, and all of this e3 first. Now you have rook d1 problem and an a2 problem, and now black is kind of doing pretty well.
Yeah, so maybe even e3 before a3 is an idea to stop bishop c4. Yeah. There are a few different ways we can definitely say that it definitely makes it a lot less clear, and it seems like even black is the one that is driving the bus right now. Yeah. So I mean, even if whether it's e3 first or a3 right away, it looks like black is for sure not going to lose this game, and at least might just be winning. So yeah, it doesn't seem to work out. But anyways, why am I going all the way back? So anyways, after f takes c4, c3, king f2, I just thought this move king f2 was just such class, basically, because you notice that there's basically no counterplay, and you get your king to the center, and there really just isn't much for black to do. And I think the rest of the game, you can understand here that white is pretty much in the driver's seat, because the rook is, again, covering the b7 pawn, the knight covering the bishop, really every piece is kind of kept in place. And so all that's left for white to do is to just round up the pawns in a relatively efficient manner. And yeah, we can see how that's done here the rest of the game. So after king f2, black played bishop a2, clearing the e6 square for the knight. But what a sad move to make, putting the bishop in the place where you would hope that your pawn goes. And now a6. This guy, Ivanchuk, just till the end is just absolute class. That must be taken. And now rook b8. And so who would have thought that we just spoke about how the a6 pawn is the pride of the position, and all of a sudden it's just jettisoned to create an even more significant bind. And now we could actually see why king f2 is played, because after rook f7, king e3, all of a sudden the king is not in the box as it would have been on g1 if white went for a6 right away. So the difference is, if we just back up, you know, white could have gone for a6 right away, but then the issue is after rook f7, it's harder to round up the pawns and to keep the kind of positional bind or zugzwang that's almost happening with the king not coming out. And so playing king f2 enabled that to happen. And it's just fantastic judgment. And I should say, Ivanchuk is for sure like one of these chess artists. And what I mean by that is sometimes he will play for like beauty, even when it might not be the absolute mathematically best move. There are definitely some other players out there in the world today like that. I used to consider myself in that realm, but recently I've changed a little bit. Dubov is certainly that way. Arnav, that's a good suggestion. Also, Richard Rapport is also that way. Also very strong, but also that way. And even Joe Bava to a certain extent. But it's amazing when you can still play for beauty, but not compromise the overall strength of the moves. And that's something Ivanchuk did at a very high level for a long time. So anyways, we get to this position after rook f7, check king e3, and it's totally busted. The rook now is tethered to the knight. The king is pinned. The knight can't move. White is how many pawns down? 2 pawns down, but they're A pawns that aren't really going anywhere. This bishop is the hardest working bishop in the business, attacking and defending at the same time. And it's really just, it's just completely lost, strangely enough. Or maybe not so strangely. Black played the move g6 just to try and get out the bind. And white played bishop d6. I mean, just cruel even to the end. Now just going to switch the bishop to a new diagonal. I said the bishop was the hardest working in the business. And after rook f6, rook d8, just still keeping the bind. Note that the king can't go to g7 now because bishop takes e5. The rook can't move because then f8 hangs. Yikes. A3, bishop takes a3, doesn't really change much. King g7, bishop d6 back. And you can see the remaining pawns are just super weak and collected all one by one.
Brutal.
And actually after rook c8 here, Karjakin had enough and resigned. I don't know about you. I thought that game was pretty awesome. I mean, again, the opening kind of was, you know, most people would just click through the moves and think, oh, nothing happened. It was kind of a punt. But if you just go back just to like the grip that happened here, I think it all started with this knight c5 move, which I think was probably a bit inaccurate because in the long terms, the d5 square is sensitive and the c5 pawn is a bit weak. The queen e1 is a really nice touch, you know, thinking about queen f2, as we mentioned, and then this f3 consolidating the king side and going for positional play with knight a4. And note that this queen e1 also still covering a5, even while thinking about queen f2, was just brilliant. And then we have this scenario where the queen actually changes course because the knight left the c3 square, and all of a sudden we have pressure on the c4 pawn. And then that's transformed with queen a3, which seems like a very strange move. That's just clearing the c3 square for the pawn to go to c3 of the knight, but also setting up b5, which turns out to just work beautifully. This left a tremendous, tremendous impression just because of the bind, the grip. What other synonym can I use? You get the point. It was just pretty amazing. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed that one, but I do want to show the other game actually. And I guess I won't have as much time for this game. So let me know, Kostya, if I should, you know, what time we should be ending, because I can kind of jump out of the immediate if we only have like 15 minutes.
I think
then I won't spend so much time.
We can go for like another 20 minutes, I'd say.
Okay. All right. So anyways, this next game that I'll show is, let me leave this one, is actually, I do know Shankland teaches classes sometimes. So my condolences to him being on the receiving end of one of these. But this was truly a spectacular game. And to be honest, I was looking at it the other day and it still amazed me. It really did. And I mean, I don't want to like, you know, kind of traffic and hyperbole, but it's one of the more remarkable games I've ever seen, just because it's not like just winning after he does it, but it just shows such brilliant judgment. So anyways, I'll spend less time on the opening than usual, but here we go. Ivanchuk is white and Shankland is black. And this was actually played pretty kind of recently, 2017, not like a million years ago. So, all right, so D4, I mean, Shankland was, you know, he's like already, you know, almost 2,700 here. So D4, knight F6, C4, E6, knight F3, B6. So we have a Queen's Indian, it seems, on our hands. G3, bishop B4 check, bishop B2, bishop E7, knight C3, bishop B7, and Queen C2. And Queen C2, I already want to point out, it's a classic kind of Ivanchuk going his own way type of move, because this is not very popular at all. You can check your database. I checked the online database the other day, and it's much less popular than bishop G2. And this is just classic Ivanchuk. He's well known for playing the sideline at a super elite level, but it's not like it's a bad move. It's just like second or third choice. Now everyone does that, right? If they're trying to find new ideas, they look at the other choices besides the first line, because they assume that the person they're playing knows the first line. Shankland didn't test him in what might be considered a bit critical, because he actually played castles right away, which I think is actually a good decision. One could also try the move knight c6. And just to show you a line, I looked at very briefly. Again, not super high depth, so take it with a grain of salt. But knight c6 does threaten knight takes d4 right away, right? Because the bishop is kind of doing things on this diagonal, or at least it makes it something you have to think about. Because, I mean, not right away, but if the bishop goes to g2, then knight takes d4 is a problem. Right away, it might be an issue because the bishop might be trapped after f3. But anyway, the line I saw was e4, knight b4, queen b1 to defend the e4 pawn, and knight takes e4, knight takes f5, knight eg5, h6 to soften up the f3 knight, and knight f7, nice. King takes f7, and bishop g2. Wow. And to be honest, I think this is the type of position Ivanchuk would have probably known and been absolutely happy to play, because white is a pawn down, but has some initiative. Of course, knight e5 check is already an idea. And it's just a very irregular position where it does seem to me, at least in the short term, that white's king is going to be safer. So something to think about. Maybe you can expand on this, or have some fun analyzing in your own games. I didn't want to spend too much time in the opening, but Aryan asked why couldn't black play bishop takes f3, and I think that's a fair question. You see this structure a lot sometimes in these Indian types of defenses, and more often than not, actually, the bishop is more valuable than the double pawns. So it's one thing if you can kind of surround the d4 pawn and maybe win it, but a lot of times, actually, you play e takes f3, and sometimes white can get f4, f5 in. But even if they can't, a lot of times you'll find the bishop coming to h3 is actually quite annoying, because it puts indirect pressure on e6 after white castles and gets a rook to e1. And in many circumstances, you'll find that the double pawns are not a huge issue. And in fact, there are openings nowadays with black where people are very happy to get these double f pawns like let's say, the Tartakower variation of the Caro-Kann, which is already becoming some type of main line where they go, for those that aren't familiar, if you get, this is basically becoming the main line after knight c3, this position. And, of course here, black is actually a bit behind of white in terms of, white has the first move and they still don't mind the structure. So if you kind of curious about how to play with these double pawns and these F pawns in particular with either color, actually very, very worth your time to kind of study this opening, or even just look at some Trompowskis, because it's something that's really taking off in many, many different openings, the structure that is. So anyways, let's get back to the game. So we have queen c2, Shankland castles, bishop g2, knight c6, now castles, now knight takes d4 is no longer an issue. And we have d5, and basically Shankland was, I think, trying to equalize with this. So d5, c takes d5, knight b4, queen a4, knight takes d5, basically almost getting like a semi-tearish type of structure, which can happen after knight takes d3. And with the bishop already on the diagonal, ready to challenge the white bishop on g2, white is maybe marginally better, but not that much. And that's always kind of the thing in these Queen's Gambit, Catalan type of positions, is whether the bishop on g2 will be opposed or not, because that's really kind of helps you determine who's better and why. After knight d5, Ivanchuk played rook d1, and Shankland went queen e8, which I think is maybe slightly inaccurate. I think knight takes c3 is a little bit better, just because you want to trade some minor pieces, you lack some space. I can understand why maybe he's a bit reluctant to do this, open the rook up against the queen, but I think it would have been a bit safer to play in this way. White still is better though, it must be said. I mean, knight e5, knight c6 is an idea to kind of soften up those light squares, and yeah, white is still a little better. But anyways, let's get to the good stuff. So rook d1, queen e8, queen takes d8, rook takes d8. Shankland, I'm sure, was happy with this queen exchange. Reduces the pressure in the position. Knight e5, we can see the bishop kind of doing some stuff here. c5, the break that black basically always wants in the structure if they can manage. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, and rook ac1, rook ac8, and rook a8 is slightly inaccurate. Bishop d4 is a little bit better, but even here white would be a tiny bit better because this knight d3 move. You find in a lot of these Catalans, you get the knight to d3, you're protecting all the relevant squares, and you might have some pressure on the c file. And now we're finally in the point, the place after rook ac1, rook ac8, where the game just kind of takes off in a way that is truly unbelievable. So I know we don't have a whole ton of time for this game, but knight b5 attacks the a pawn, right? So a6. Okay. What to do here? What was the point of knight b5 if the knight can just be kicked away? The computer actually believes knight a7 is the best move, which I don't blame Ivanchuk for not playing. It's actually, basically it's kind of, again, playing against the c6 square, which is kind of the soft spot in black's position right now. And, after you play a move like rook c7, there's b4, and the tactics tend to work out for black. But why I'm showing this game is because after a6, white played rook takes c5. And I was like, wait, what is going on here? Because after rook takes c5, rook takes knight d6, the queens are off the board. White is a full exchange down. And okay, the bishop on b7 is hanging, the rook on e8 is hanging, so rook b8, knight e takes f7. White has one pawn for the exchange, and it's not like there's a mating attack here. So it's like, well, what's actually the issue? And it turns out here that this position is actually extremely, extremely difficult to play. And it just was tremendous judgment by Ivanchuk to even go for this. I mean, and it's also kind of risky in a way, because you can see the knights kind of protecting each other. You might think, well, aren't they kind of in the cookie jar? Like, are they able to get out? And it just turns out that it's not actually totally the case. So I'm going to ask you as black how you would respond, not in this position, but after bishop a8, which is a good move, defending this, keeping this bishop alive. Shankland played the best moves to defend for the next several. So kudos to him for defending for a time, but just the pressure here was quite remarkable. And after bishop a8, I would like to ask, what are White's next two moves? Because you have to kind of show something here, at least justify what you've done. And it looks like these knights are kind of, in the position, but I mean, Black has the open file. What does White have here? What is White really angling for? And the next two moves really tell the story.
Hey, welcome,
So,
Raiders. We're right in the middle
I'll leave
of
it.
this.
I'll leave it to it's like ask the audience. Anyone have any suggestions?
Right in the middle of this class with Kassa, who's doing a lecture on the great Vasyl Ivanchuk. But yeah, guys, thank you to everyone who's contributing for the community challenge. That is kind of a nice thing if we can get to that level to get our channel boosted.
All right, so I'm gonna give the
more
floor
eyes.
to.
But let's get back to the class.
I've not heard from you today. Raj. You mind
Raj,
unmuting yourself?
Okay. I was thinking b4 because I just wanted to push that rook around. Because on like c5, I just wanted to unmute pretty much.
So b4, what do you think Black is gonna do?
I was thinking probably rook c6.
Rook c6?
Yeah.
Well, rook c6 is a little bit risky, I would say, because you're basically putting the rook on the same diagonal as the bishop on g2, and you're kind of blocking the light squared bishop. I actually would go rook c2. You keep the rook on the second rank, maybe start to look at some of these pawns. Pretty. And then the other thing is by playing b4, we had this discussion in the first game, which square is weakened by b4 being played?
Like, there's the a3 square. It's kind of weak.
And the c3 square, right? Because it's the squares that it's previously defending. So actually, when you play b4, to be honest, you're weakening 4 squares. But the ones that are super relevant here is the c3 square, because this knight can jump sometimes. And in general, the c file is even a bit softer. And so b4 is a move that gets a tempo, but it's not sure what you're doing. It turns out here that, and this was the idea, Ivanchuk's idea was to play e4, and after knight c7, because that's kind of that's also a good move. This is what Shankland played. It's a good move. Just f3, and it just looks like absurd that White has time to consolidate in this way. But I mean, I really thought Black was going to get a rook for 2 knights somewhere, and Black would just be winning. But these knights are actually quite secure, and now all of a sudden this bishop is shut out, and the knight is also dominated, and White can actually afford to slow play this position. And I mean, I was truly shook when I saw this. I was like, what? It's even hard. It's really hard to play this position well, especially the thing that really changed it for me, frankly, is this rook is so active. I thought the rook comes to c2, and it's like, well, this is a major problem. But it turns out that the rook coming to c2 is not, really a huge issue. And the next several moves show this in great detail. So Black played rook f8. Shankland played rook f8. That's a good move. The knight is now challenged. Bishop e3, hitting this rook on c5. And kudos, I did see some people saying e4 and bishop e3, but it was very important to play f3 and shut out, basically all of Black's minor pieces in a way. So the e4 f3 construction was really important first. After bishop e3, even here I was like, well, no way is Black doing so badly here, because, well, isn't the knight hanging on f7? Can't this rook go to c2? Well, if rook takes f7, this position is actually just losing. After knight takes f7, king takes f7, and bishop takes c5, this endgame is bad for several reasons. You still have the bishop and the knight kind of locked out. But actually, even more importantly than that at the moment is that these pawns on a6 and e5 are split, which means that there are going to be real weaknesses in targets almost immediately with a move like rook c1. And so you have a scenario where rook and pawn for the 2 minor pieces is actually something that is better for White. Actually, this is an old book, but it's actually maybe worth mentioning. There was a book called Rook versus 2 minor pieces by Esben Lund, or Silas Esben Lund, he might go by now. and it's actually pretty instructive, where he actually speaks about this material imbalance in detail, which is, it's not well covered in chess literature. So anyways, that didn't happen. By the way, in this position, after you play e5, knight d5, and f4, and this is kind of just a completely winning position for white, apparently. You can check your engines, and if you don't believe me. So anyways, instead, after bishop e3, again, Shankland plays the best move, rook c2, getting the rook supremely active, it would seem, hitting the b2 pawn and the a2 pawn. And even now, it's just like, well, isn't black just going to take the queen side? Like, what does white really have here? And Ivanchuk plays knight e5, and all of a sudden here there are more problems. It might seem supernatural to play rook takes b2, but this is actually just basically nearly winning, because after rook c1, all of a sudden the white has the open file, and a move like knight b5 actually kind of fails spectacularly to knight c8. Does anyone want to finish the line after rook takes a2?
Mate, it's forced mate. Wow, nice. Mate in 5.
Daniel?
I have no idea how he saw this stuff. I guess just knight e7, king h8, knight f7, rook f7, rook c8. It's just checkmate very soon.
Exactly. Yeah. So I did see some folks saying rook c8 first after knight e7, but very important that you you play knight f7 first. And yeah, it's just mate. But the judgment, the judgment and the foresight to understand that your knight's dancing around like this and you're just losing your queen side and you can get away with this is truly spectacular. And you can see the combination of positional and tactical. I mean, the channel switching that Ivanchuk is doing here is just insane. But again, Shankland defends well. He does not break here, and he plays the move rook d8, which is a good move. You pin the knight on d6, and it's your b2 is still hanging. It would seem like black is still kind of doing okay. But now again, another just spectacular move, bishop f1. It's just like, and all of a sudden, the bishop. It's kind of important that the bishop activates now that the pawns are kind of in this bind, and you see some potential they may be shifting over to the queen side, and in some lines it's important that rook takes d1 might not be a check. Immediately, I'll just say that knight f e8 was actually played, I think, but if rook takes b2, this doesn't work because of rook c1 anyway, and after rook takes d6, knight c4, white is going to get a full rook back. So even here, taking all the queenside pawns does not really save anything, because white is just winning here once they get a rook back, and still have the two bishops with the bind all over the place. So instead, even here after bishop f1, Shankland, he made a mistake here. This was probably the first moment where he really didn't play the right move, and the move that's really necessary here, it's not losing yet, but it's really important, it's actually b5 to kind of deprive white's minor pieces of the c4 square, because you saw in all these lines, knight c4, forking the rooks was a problem. And in some lines, even the bishop might want to use the c4 square. And so, and you also just protect the pawn, which the bishop on e3 was hitting. Unfortunately here, after several really strong moves by Ivanchuk, knight f e8 was played. And again, still not clear how you kind of bring this home, but Ivanchuk played bishop d3, just stunning, breaking the pin and also attacking the rook on c2. The reason I thought this was kind of crazy is because you're just inviting them to take your pawns.
Yeah, what's he doing?
But after rook takes b2, now you go knight dc4, and you're basically refusing to trade your active pieces for their really bad ones. That's basically it. And after rook takes a2, bishop takes b6, the squeeze continues. Now, again, white is a full exchange down. The pawns are equal, but it's very difficult to move pieces. The knight can't move. The bishop can hardly move. This knight can't move either. Just very difficult. There's a bit more to this game, and I will finish the game, but and kind of dip through it. But this is kind of the last moment where Black could really defend better, and because it goes downhill kind of quickly after this. And so I'm actually going to ask you all, what's the best way Black can defend here? Because and I'll show you the move Shankland played. Shankland played Rook A4, and that was a bad move, and it wasn't good enough. But how would you try to defend this one? Because it's not like White is winning here. It's like Black, it's still about equal.
I mean, the bishop on A8 is just so bad.
Oh no! Did I show the move by mistake when the chess space showed the options?
Oh, I didn't see.
Well, hopefully I see Daniel saw it, but hopefully no one else saw it. Yeah. All right. Any suggestions? So I see. All right. So Ashish is saying Rook B8. Yeah, that's a fair move, challenging the bishop. Yeah, that's fair. I think after Rook B8, the bishop will just move away. I want to say, I don't know if E3 is good enough, or I don't know. Anyways, the move the best move was actually A5. But good luck trying to find this move. I mean, seriously, you're just giving up your A5 pawn for what? Well, in some way, you're giving the pawn up to kind of unbalance White's coordination. So after like knight takes A5, for instance, you at least now can go Rook B8, and you can see just for the moment, White's pieces are slightly out of position. Where before there was this nice harmony, everything was kind of covering itself. Now there's something hanging in that little moment. Gives Black some opportunity to get some counterplay. I did not analyze this in depth, but one might also consider that maybe in some lines it's important that the Rook can come back to the 7th rank now that the A pawn is gone. But good luck finding this over the board. Anyway, the game kind of went downhill because after Rook A4, Rook C1, there are new threats against the C7 knight, and we very quickly saw Rook B4. King F2, Rook B5, Bishop F1. Now the bishop is no longer needed on D3. Rook B8, Knight D7, and Rook B7 is the best move here.
Okay.
Good luck blocking your bishop like that. Then after Rook D8, Knight C5.
Oh, brutal.
And all of a sudden you could see that in the last 5-6 moves, Shankland has been outplayed. You can see the White's grip is still very much on. C7 is, kind of dropping right now, and the king is completely secure. And even Rook B2, King G1, just going back. It's just beautiful touch. And basically, the last difficult move was Knight D3, protecting the Rook on C1 and attacking the Rook on B2. Sorry, I'm drawing poor arrows again. The point being that now, basically White is just one apiece, and having 2 pieces for the Rook, it's a little bit easier to win the game. And even here, I thought it was pretty. Look at these knights protecting each other, everything kind of coming together, and eventually just pushing the pawns. And here, Black actually resigned. This is not a well-known game. I know for sure that most of you have not seen this game. I don't think most people that like Ivanchuk have seen this game, but it was just so
beautiful game, so
otherworldly. There were some people actually, I heard this once years and years ago, that it was like, there was like this debate of like, if, humans had to play aliens to like save the planet, who would be the person you nominated? And of course, I mean, you probably just think of who's the best player at the time, or the most consistent player. But honestly, if you had to think about it and you said, when they're at their very best, who is the most dangerous? I almost would have to go with Ivanchuk, because he was someone that on his best day was just, I mean, it was almost not human, like in some ways. Like it really wasn't. And you can see it from like his greatest hits, like when he beat Kasparov. He was even a bit of an annoying opponent for Carlsen. If you recall, in the candidates tournament, he actually beat him with Black, the one candidates tournament that Carlsen played in. He lost with White to Ivanchuk. So he was someone that really did annoy and bother all of the champions because he had that amazing ability as a universal player to kind of play what would bother you and switch from tactical to positional and back and forth. And these are just not super well-known games, but I hope they left an impression on you. Anyways, that is it for me. I guess, Kostya, you can jump in, maybe take a question or two. I don't know how we do this now.
Cool. No, I think that'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Kassa. That was awesome. Yeah, these games were really brilliant. I actually got to play Chucky a couple of years ago in Gibraltar, so that was really cool.
Awesome. Yeah, what a guy.
Yeah, that was a highlight. All right, thanks everyone for the class. We'll catch you guys next time. Thank you, Kassa.
All right, have a good one.